Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Out in this country, some men make noise to prove they're dangerous. But the most dangerous men are the ones who have learned the value of silence. This is the story of such a man, who buried his guns along with his heart, only to have a pack of fools dig them both back up. They thought they were burning down a rancher's home. They were actually setting a ghost free. For 5 years, Calder Holt had lived in conversation with ghosts. They were not screaming ghosts. They were the quiet kind. The ghost of a woman's laugh in the morning sun. The ghost of a small hand gripping his finger. They lived in the pinewood cabin he had built with his own hands, in the silence between the gusts of wind, and in the cold space beside him in his narrow bed. His ranch, tucked away in a small, nameless valley near the New Mexico border, was not a place of business. It was a monastery. Every mended fence was a prayer. Every horse groomed was an act of penance. He had come here after the winter fever had taken his wife, Sarah, and their young son, Daniel, leaving him with a silence inside that was vaster than the empty land around him. He sought not forgiveness, knew there was none for failing to protect your family from an enemy you couldn't shoot but oblivion. He had almost succeeded. The people in the nearest town, a dusty settlement called Redemption, knew him as Silent Holt, a quiet, solitary rancher who came for supplies 4 times a year, spoke only when necessary, and kept to himself. He had no friends and, he believed, no enemies. He was a man who had successfully erased himself from the world. The man he had erased was named Calder Holt, but he had another name. A name whispered in saloons and ranger camps from the Llano Estacado to the Colorado Rockies, Ghost Hand. They called him that for a simple, brutal reason. In his former life as a bounty hunter, no one had ever seen him draw his gun and live to tell the tale. The moment his hand moved, the story ended. He was not fast. He was final. That man, the Ghost Hand, had been buried in an unmarked grave the same day he had buried his family. The Red Creek gang knew nothing of this. To them, Calder Holt was just an old, stubborn man sitting on a piece of land they wanted. They were bootleggers, the greasy, violent outfit run by a man named Bo Ramsey, and they had decided Calder's Valley was the perfect, hidden route to smuggle their whiskey north. They paid him a visit one Tuesday afternoon. 5 of them, led by Ramsey himself, a big man with a florid face and small, greedy eyes. They rode into his yard, their horses trampling the small patch of wildflowers Sarah had planted. "Holt," Ramsey had bellowed, not dismounting. "We're here to make you an offer on this piece of dirt. $500. It was an insult, not an offer. The land and its spring were worth 10 times that. Calder came out onto his porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with graying hair and eyes the color of a winter storm. He looked at them, his face an unreadable mask. "The land's not for sale," he said, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse. Ramsey laughed. "That wasn't a request. We need this valley. You can take the 500, or you can take a pine box. Your choice." Calder didn't move. He didn't reach for the worn coat that was always on his hip, a habit he couldn't break. He simply stood there, a silent and movable object. His silence was more unnerving than any threat. It baffled them. They expected pleading, or anger, or fear. They got nothing. "Have it your way, old man," Ramsey snarled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Calder's boots. "We'll be back." They rode off, laughing. Calder stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dust settle. He felt no fear. He felt a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had just wanted to be left alone with his ghosts. A week later, they came back. Calder was asleep, lost in a rare, dreamless slumber, when the smell of smoke woke him. He opened his eyes to a hellish orange glow. The walls of his cabin were on fire. He stumbled out of bed, choking on the thick, acrid smoke, grabbing his rifle and his pistol out of pure, ingrained instinct. He burst out the front door just as the roof began to collapse in a shower of sparks and embers. He saw them then, a dozen of them, sitting on their horses in a semicircle, their faces lit by the flames of his burning home. They were passing a bottle and laughing. "Look at him," one of them shouted. "Old stone Silent Holt. Not so quiet now, are ya?" They had driven off his horses, the only living things he cared for. They had burned his home, the sanctuary where the ghosts of his wife and son lived. They had taken everything from him, Ian. And they were laughing. Calder stood there, a silhouette against the inferno, his face blackened with soot, his expression hidden in the flickering shadows. He watched them, and something inside him that had been frozen for 5 years began to thaw. It wasn't warmth. It was a cold, clear, calculating fire. The grief that had defined him was still there, but it was being forged into something else, something hard and sharp. They expected him to run, to cry, to beg. They did not see his hand move. Because when Calder Holt's hand moved, no one was left to tell the tale. They were so focused on the big fire, on their own drunken amusement, that they didn't notice the small, quiet man in the center of it all. He didn't draw. Not yet. To draw now would be to kill them all, and that would be a mercy. These men would not get a quick death from a ghost's hand. They would get something worse. They would get to know the ghost first. They would learn to fear the silence before it consumed them. He sank to his knees in the dirt, a seemingly broken man. The gang, their sport concluded, gave one last whoop of drunken victory and rode off into the night, their laughter echoing in the valley. Calder Holt, the rancher, died that night in the ashes of his home. As the sun rose, a different man got to his feet. He was no longer a monk in a lonely monastery. He was a hunter. He walked through the smoking ruins of his life, his eyes not looking for keepsakes, but for clues. He found what he was looking for, a clear boot print near the back wall, made by a man with a worn-down left heel, a discarded whiskey bottle, a brand only sold in one saloon in Redemption, an empty cartridge from a .45 to 70 Springfield, a rifle not common among simple outlaws. The quiet, grieving rancher would have seen only wreckage. But Ghost Hand saw a trail. He stood in the center of the devastation, the rising sun casting his long shadow across the blackened earth. He had made a silent oath to himself 5 years ago, an oath of peace, of penance. That oath was now ash, along with everything else. He made a new one. A quiet, cold promise to the ghosts of his wife and son, and to the men who had just made the fatal mistake of waking him from his long sleep. They would be investigated, they would be tracked, and they would be punished. Not just with death, but with the terror that precedes it. The Ghost Hand was back, and he was coming to collect. For 2 days, Calder lived in the ruins. He was not mourning, he was preparing. He salvaged what little he could, a cast iron skillet, a handful of scorched tools, and, from a heavy metal box buried under the floorboards, his old gear. It was the equipment of a life he had tried to forget. A finely balanced Bowie knife, a spyglass, and a set of custom leather saddlebags that held the tools of the bounty hunter's trade, manacles, tracking powders, and a small, leather-bound journal. He opened the journal. The pages were filled with his own tight, precise script notes on men he had hunted years ago. Their habits, their weaknesses, their associates. He had been a meticulous predator. As he read, the dormant instincts began to stir, the old skills returning like a half-forgotten language. He spent the first day forging a new set of horseshoes in the ruins of his lean-to smithy. They were of a unique design, with a small, almost imperceptible notch on the left side. It was a tracker's trick, a way to mark his own trail if he needed to, and to differentiate it from any other. He had found one of his horses, a tough buckskin mare, grazing in a nearby canyon where the gang had missed her. She would be enough. On the third morning, he rode out of his valley. He was no longer Silent Holt, the rancher. His face was a hard, emotionless mask. His eyes, which had been clouded with grief, were now clear and sharp, constantly scanning, reading the land. He wore his old, worn duster, and the Colt on his hip seemed to have settled into a more comfortable, more natural position. He was the Ghost Hand again, and he was on the hunt. His first destination was Redemption. The town was a cesspool of miners, drifters, and outlaws, a place where a man could get information if he knew how to listen. Calder knew how to listen. He rode into town and tied his mare not in front of the saloon, but in a quiet alley 2 streets away. He moved through the town not as a resident, but as an infiltrator. He didn't go to the saloon that sold the Red Creek Gang's brand of whiskey. That would be too obvious. Instead, he went to the livery stable. The hostler was a young kid, no older than 17, with eyes that saw more than he let on. Calder didn't ask questions. He simply offered to help the kid mend a broken harness. For an hour, they worked in a comfortable, masculine silence. Calder's hands, skilled and sure, impressed the boy. "You handle leather well, mister," the kid said. "Been a while," Calder replied, his voice a low rumble. He tested the new stitching. "Lot of new horses in town lately." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The kid spat. "Too many. A dozen of them, belonging to Bo Ramsey's bunch. Mean animals. Poorly kept." He lowered his voice. "One of them was branded with the Circle H. Holt's brand. Heard his place burned down a few nights back." "That's so," Calder said, his expression unchanging. "Yeah," the kid said, warming to his subject. "Ramsey's boys were in the saloon last night, bragging about it." Said the old man just sat there and cried. The kid looked at Calder. "You knew him." "Heard of him," Calder said, finishing the harness. He tossed the kid a silver dollar. "For your time." He left the livery, his first piece of information confirmed. His horses were here. Now he needed to find the man with the worn-down left heel. That would be a bootmaker's job. He didn't go to the main bootmaker. He went to a small, dusty shop run by an old German immigrant named Schmidt, a man known for his meticulous work and his discreet nature. Calder didn't ask about the Red Creek gang. He asked about getting a new pair of boots made. As Schmidt measured his feet, Calder talked about the importance of a good, even heel. "A man's gait tells a story, doesn't it?" Calder mused. "A worn-down heel can mean a limp, an old injury." The old German grunted in agreement. "Or a sloppy walk. I see it all the time. Like that one of Ramsey's thugs. A man named Jed. Always comes in, complaining about his left heel. I tell him, it is not the boot, it is the way you walk, with a slouch. He never listens. Jed. He had a name. Calder paid for the boots he wouldn't be collecting and left. He now had a name and a physical characteristic. But he didn't go looking for Jed. The time for confrontation was not yet. He needed to find their lair. He knew a gang that brazen, that confident, would have a main camp, a place where they felt safe. It wouldn't be in town. It would be somewhere close, but hidden. He spent the rest of the day in the hills overlooking Redemption, using his spyglass. He was not looking for men. He was looking for signs. A thin wisp of smoke where there should be none. A flock of buzzards circling. The faint, barely visible trail of a dozen riders. Late in the afternoon, he found it. A trail, leading away from the main road and into a series of badlands and canyons to the east. It was a smuggler's route. He followed it, keeping to the high ground. The trail led him to a box canyon, a natural fortress with steep walls and only one entrance. There, he saw their camp. A collection of rough tents and a large, central campfire. He could see his own stolen horses in a makeshift corral. He counted 15 men. They were relaxed, drinking, gambling. They were fat and happy in their den. He spent hours watching them through his spyglass, a silent, patient predator. He learned their faces. He learned their routines. He saw the man named Jed, a big, slovenly man who walked with the exact slouch the bootmaker had described. He saw Bo Ramsey, holding court like a king. He had found them. He had all the information he needed. Any other bounty hunter would have ridden back to the nearest town and tried to raise a posse. But Calder Holt was not any other bounty hunter. A posse was loud and clumsy. A posse gave a man a chance to surrender or fight. The Red Creek gang would get no such chance. As darkness fell, Calder retreated from his perch. He did not go back to town. He made a cold camp a mile from their canyon, a place where his small fire would not be seen. He ate his jerky and drank his water, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He would not attack the camp. That was a fool's game. He would do what he did best. He would hunt. He would wait for one of them to get separated from the pack. His journal from his old life had a section on Bo Ramsey's known associates. He had a hunch. He found the entry for a man named Slim Perkins, a known fence for stolen goods in the region. According to the journal, Perkins had a weakness for a particular kind of cheap, sweet cigar. The next day, Calder did not watch the gang's camp. He watched the road leading from Redemption to the east. Late in the afternoon, he saw a lone rider. The man was big and slouching. It was Jed. He was riding toward a small, isolated trading post a few miles from the gang's canyon. Calder knew, with a hunter's certainty, that this was his moment. The wolf had left the pack. He mounted his mare and followed, a silent, gray ghost against the backdrop of the setting sun. The hunt had begun. The first of the damned was about to learn the true meaning of the name Ghost Hand. The trading post was a sad, lonely affair, little more than a dusty shack with a sagging porch. It was run by a man with shifty eyes who was known to buy things without asking about their origins. It was the perfect place for a man like Jed to run an errand for his boss. Calder watched from a rocky outcrop as Jed tied his horse and went inside. A few minutes later, he came out, a box of cheap cigars tucked under his arm. He mounted up and began the lazy ride back to the canyon. He was confident, unsuspecting, lost in the simple satisfaction of a task completed. He never saw the silent figure detach itself from the landscape behind him. Calder did not close the distance quickly. He was in no hurry. He trailed Jed for a mile, keeping to the ravines and shadows, a patient, inexorable presence. He wanted Jed to get farther from the trading post, farther from any potential help. He wanted him to be completely, utterly alone. The place he chose was a narrow arroyo, a dry riverbed with steep, sandy banks. As Jed rode into the arroyo, Calder made his move. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't fire a shot. He urged his mare into a sudden, silent burst of speed, coming up alongside Jed's horse like a phantom. Jed grunted in surprise as Calder's horse slammed into his. Before he could even reach for his gun, Calder was on him. A powerful arm wrapped around his throat, yanking him from the saddle. They crashed to the sandy ground in a heap. The fight was over before it began. Jed was a big man, strong from a life of bullying, but Calder moved with a brutal, economic efficiency. A sharp blow to the temple with the butt of his Colt, and Jed went limp. When Jed woke up, the world was a throbbing, confusing mess. The first thing he saw was the night sky, a cold, star-dusted canvas. The second thing he felt was the rough rope that bound his hands and feet. The third thing he saw was the man, sitting by a small, smokeless fire a few feet away, sharpening a Bowie knife. "What? Who are you?" Jed stammered, his head pounding. Calder didn't look up from his work. The rhythmic shing-shing-shing of steel on stone was the only sound in the arroyo. "You burned down my home," Calder said, his voice a low, flat monotone. Recognition, and then pure, animal terror, dawned on Jed's face. The old rancher, Holt. But this was not the quiet, stoic man they had laughed at. The man sitting before him had the eyes of a wolf, cold and utterly devoid of mercy. "Look, mister," Jed pleaded, his voice cracking. "That was Ramsey's idea. All of it. I was just following orders. We didn't mean no real harm." Calder stopped sharpening the knife. He tested the edge with his thumb, then slowly stood up and walked over to Jed. He crouched down, his face a mask of stone in the firelight. "You stole my horses," Calder said. "You burned the house my wife died in. You laughed." Jed started to babble, to offer money, to promise anything. Calder let him. He was not interested in his pleas. He was interested in information. He began his interrogation. It was not a violent process. He didn't need to lay a hand on Jed. His quiet, menacing presence and the gleaming edge of the Bowie knife were enough. He learned the names of the men who had been at the fire. He learned the gang's command structure. He learned about their next whiskey shipment, due in 3 days. Jed, in his terror, was a fountain of information, desperate to trade his secrets for his life. When Calder was satisfied, he stood up. Jed looked at him, a pathetic glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You'll let me go now, right?" he whimpered. "I told you everything. I'm going to let you go," Calder said. Jed's face flooded with relief. "But first," Calder continued, his voice dropping even lower, "you're going to deliver a message for me." He took a brand from the fire. It was not a cattle brand. It was a simple iron rod he had heated until it glowed a malevolent orange. It was the barrel of an old, broken pistol he had found in the arroyo. Jed's eyes went wide with horror. He began to struggle to scream, but he was helpless. The next morning, a rider from the Red Creek gang, sent to find out what was keeping Jed, found his horse wandering with its reins dragging. He followed the tracks into the arroyo. What he found there would become the stuff of dark legend in their camp. Jed was alive, as promised. He was sitting on the ground, endbound, his back against the sandy bank. He was rocking back and forth, staring at nothing, a thin line of drool running from his mouth. He was muttering the same word over and over again. "Ghost, ghost, ghost." His gun belt was gone. His boots were gone. And burned into his forehead, a perfect, searing circle, was the brand of a gun barrel's muzzle. A single, Terrifying mark. A signature. The writer tried to talk to Jed, but the man's mind was broken. He had been so terrified, had stared into the face of such cold, implacable vengeance, that something inside him had simply snapped. The writer loaded the gibbering Jed onto his horse and galloped back to the canyon, his face pale with a new and familiar emotion. Fear. The story he told sent a ripple of unease through the camp. Bo Ramsey was furious. He saw the brand on Jed's forehead and understood its meaning. This was a challenge, a declaration of war. But from whom? No one had seen anything. Jed could only babble about a silent ghost with winter in his eyes. The men, who had been laughing and confident, were now quiet and watchful. They started looking over their shoulders. They began to see shadows in the twilight that hadn't been there before. Calder Holt had not just taken out one of their men. He had done something far more effective. He had sent back a messenger. He had given their fear a name, whispered by a broken man. Ghost. Miles away, Calder watched the gang's canyon through his spyglass. He saw the increased number of guards, the nervous energy of the men. He had fired his first shot in a war of nerves. He had given them an education in fear. And class, he thought grimly, was just getting started. The fear that Calder had planted in the Red Creek gang's camp was a slow-acting poison. The story of what happened to Jed spread through the men like a fever. They had laughed at a victim, and the victim had sent back a piece of their own, broken and branded, with a single, terrifying word on his lips: ghost. They started double-guarding the canyon entrance. The lazy card games around the campfire were replaced by tense, quiet clusters of men, their hands never far from their guns. Bo Ramsey was enraged, not just by the attack, but by the fear it had sown. A leader who couldn't protect his men, who couldn't even identify his enemy, was no leader at all. He sent out patrols, not just to scout, but to project an image of strength. It was a fatal mistake. A wolf pack is strongest when it is together. By sending his wolves out in pairs and threes, he was simply making them easier prey for the ghost that haunted them. Calder, from his hidden vantage points, watched and waited. He had the information he'd squeezed from Jed. The next whiskey shipment was due. The gang was supplying a network of illegal saloons and corrupt army outposts to the north. Their supply line was their lifeblood. Calder decided it was time to cut an artery. According to Jed, the whiskey was smuggled in barrels, floated down the Rio Puerco at night to a designated pickup point. It was a clever system, quiet and difficult to patrol. But it had a weakness: it relied on the river. Calder scouted the river for 2 days. He found the perfect spot: a narrow, deep channel flanked by a high, crumbling bluff. The bluff was composed of loose shale and sun-baked clay, an unstable wall of earth held together by little more than gravity and stubbornness. He spent a day preparing his trap. He didn't use dynamite; it would be too loud, too obvious. He used patience and physics. With a pickaxe he had salvaged from his ruined smithy, he painstakingly carved away at the base of the bluff, creating a deep, hidden undercut. He shored up the weakened cliff face with a series of sturdy log braces, all of them connected by a single, thick rope. The end of the rope was tied to a heavy boulder, which he positioned precariously on the edge of the opposite bank. To release the trap, all he had to do was push the boulder into the river. It was the work of a patient engineer of destruction, a man who understood that sometimes the most devastating weapon is the earth itself. On the third night, he was in position, hidden in a thicket of salt cedar on the far bank, watching the dark, slow-moving water. Just after midnight, he saw them. 2 large rafts, lashed together, carrying at least 30 barrels of whiskey. 2 men were on each raft, pulling them through the slow current. They were quiet, their voices low, but their confidence was apparent. This was a routine run. Calder waited until the rafts were directly in the channel, right below the weakened bluff. He took a deep breath. He put his shoulder to the boulder and heaved. The boulder tipped over the edge with a low groan and plunged into the river with a deep, muffled splash. The rope, tied to the log braces, went taut. The braces were ripped away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a giant sigh, the entire bluff gave way. It wasn't a loud explosion. It was a low, terrifying rumble as thousands of tons of rock and earth slid into the river. A massive wave of displaced water erupted, capsizing the rafts instantly. Barrels and men were thrown into the churning, muddy water. The 4 bootleggers, sputtering and disoriented, found themselves in a nightmare. The river, which had been their highway, was now a deadly, churning trap. But that was only the beginning of Calder's plan. As the men struggled in the water, a new element was added to the chaos. From the top of the remaining bluff, a series of flaming arrows arched through the night sky. Calder had prepared them in advance, rags soaked in kerosene tied just below the arrowheads. The arrows plunged into the river. The whiskey barrels, many of them cracked and splintered by the rock slide, were leaking their flammable contents. The surface of the river, now coated in a sheen of high-proof whiskey, ignited. The river itself became a sheet of blue and orange flame. The 4 men screamed, trapped between the churning, rock-filled water and the fire that was spreading across its surface. They scrambled for the banks, their clothes singed, their faces masks of pure terror. They all made it out of the water alive. That was part of the plan. Calder was not there to kill them. He was there to send another message. As the 4 terrified, half-drowned men huddled on the bank, watching their livelihood burn on the water, a single shot rang out from the darkness. It wasn't aimed at them. The bullet struck a whiskey barrel that had been washed ashore, blowing it apart, spraying them with the same liquid that was burning on the river. The message was clear, and spoken, and terrifying. I could have killed you. I let you live. Go and tell your master what you saw. Calder melted back into the night, his work done. He had cost Bo Ramsey a fortune. He had destroyed a crucial part of their operation. But more importantly, he had escalated the psychological war. The story the 4 bootleggers told was even more terrifying than Jed's. They didn't speak of a ghost. They spoke of a demon. A spirit of the earth who could make the cliffs fall and set the very water on fire. They hadn't seen a soul. The attack had come from the land itself. In the Red Creek Gang's camp, the poison of fear spread deeper. The men were now not just afraid of the shadows, they were afraid of the land itself. The wilderness, which had been their refuge, their hunting ground, was now hostile, an accomplice to the phantom that was hunting them. Bo Ramsey's rage turned to a cold, simmering paranoia. He was being dismantled, his operation crippled, his men terrified, and he still didn't know who he was fighting. He gathered his remaining men, his eyes sweeping over their fearful faces. There is no ghost, he snarled, though his own voice lacked conviction. There is no demon. It's a man. Just one man. And we are going to hunt him down. We're going to put every man we have into the field. We will sweep every canyon, every arroyo. We will not stop until we have his head on a pike. He was making another mistake, born of desperation. He was abandoning his fortress, sending all his men out into the wilderness to hunt a single shadow. He was leading his pack out of its den and into the hunting ground of the ghost. And the ghost was waiting. Bo Ramsey's decision to launch an all-out manhunt was the desperate act of a king who felt his throne crumbling. He split his remaining force down to a little over 20 men into 5 large patrols. Their orders were simple: sweep the territory, question everyone, and shoot anything that seemed suspicious. He was throwing a wide, clumsy net, hoping to catch the ghost that plagued him. Calder, watching from a distant ridge, saw the patrols leave the canyon. It was exactly what he had hoped for. Ramsey, in his arrogance and fury, had abandoned his fortress and scattered his army. He had made them vulnerable. For a week, Calder became a phantom. He did not engage the patrols directly. He shadowed them, a silent, unseen presence. He used their own hunt against them. He would leave false trails, leading them on grueling, waterless chases through the Badlands. He would use his notched horseshoes to lay a clear track heading north, only to double back and circle behind them. His war was one of attrition, not of bullets. He would sneak into their camps at night, not to kill, but to sabotage. He would pour out their water barrels. He would steal small, crucial items: a box of ammunition, a side of bacon, a sack of coffee. He wanted them tired, thirsty, hungry, and on edge. He was wearing them down, physically and mentally, turning their hunt into a miserable, demoralizing ordeal. The men on patrol became jumpy and irritable. They started seeing ghosts in every rock formation, hearing threats in every gust of wind. They argued amongst themselves, their fear turning to suspicion. The ghost was not just in the wilderness around them, he was in their heads. After a week of this torment, Calder decided it was time to remove another piece from the board. He chose his target carefully, a patrol of 4 men operating in a region of flat, open scrubland, far from any help. His plan was simple: brutal, and designed to send the most terrifying message yet. He shot their horses from a distance of over half a mile, using the powerful .45 to 70 Springfield he had taken from Jed's saddle. He began to execute the animals. He was a master marksman, and in the open terrain, the horses were easy targets. He didn't fire quickly. He took his time. Each shot was a deafening boom that echoed across the plains, followed by the scream of a dying horse. The four outlaws were thrown into a panic. They were stranded, afoot, in the middle of a vast, empty landscape, with a sniper they couldn't see picking them off at his leisure. They dove for cover behind some sparse sagebrush, firing their pistols blindly in the direction of the shots, their bullets falling harmlessly short. Calder fired 4 shots. 4 horses went down. Then, he went silent. He didn't fire on the men. He just waited. The 4 outlaws were now trapped. They were miles from water, their heavy gun belts and boots a death sentence under the blazing sun. They knew the sniper was still out there, watching them. The silence was more terrifying than the shooting had been. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on them without mercy. Their throats grew parched. Their initial panic turned to a grim, desperate despair. They were going to die out here, of thirst and heat, while their invisible enemy watched. That was Calder's intention. He was not just killing them. He was letting the land kill them. He was making them feel the same helpless, slow agony that his family had felt as the fever took them. It was a cold, cruel, and deeply personal act of retribution. By late afternoon, 2 of the men, crazed with thirst, decided to make a run for it. They stood up and began to stagger off in the direction they thought was north. They didn't get 50 yards. 2 shots, perfectly placed, echoed across the plains. Both men fell, their desperate flight cut short. Now there were 2. The remaining outlaws, seeing what had happened to their friends, did not move. They huddled behind the dead horses, sobbing in terror and dehydration. They were broken men. As the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows, Calder finally made his approach. He moved in a wide circle, coming up behind their position. They were so consumed by their fear of the distant sniper that they never thought to look behind them. He appeared before them as if he had risen from the earth itself, a tall, silent figure in the twilight. The 2 outlaws looked up, their faces masks of cracked lips and utter, soul-shattering terror. They were too weak to even raise their guns. "Please," one of them rasped, his voice a dry croak. "Water." Calder looked at them with his cold, storm-gray eyes. He offered no water. He offered no mercy. He did what he had come to do. He left the 4 bodies arranged in a circle, their dead eyes staring up at the sky. In the center of the circle, he left a single, mocking object, an empty canteen. The message was for the buzzards, and for the patrol that would eventually find them. The buzzards were the first to arrive, their dark wings circling in the sky, a grim beacon. 2 days later, another of Ramsey's patrols, drawn by the circling birds, found the scene. They saw the dead horses, the bodies, the empty canteen. The story it told was one of a slow, agonizing death, orchestrated by a hunter of incredible skill and unimaginable cruelty. The patrol didn't even bother to bury the bodies. They mounted their horses and rode back to the canyon as fast as they could, their faces ashen. When Bo Ramsey heard their story, the last of his arrogant rage finally broke, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar dread. He had sent out hunters, but he had been the one who was being hunted. He had lost 9 men, and he had never even seen his enemy. His army was being dismantled, his men were on the verge of mutiny, and the ghost was still out there. He made a decision. He called off the hunt. He gathered his remaining men, a mere dozen now, and pulled them back into the relative safety of the Box Canyon. He would not be caught in the open again. He would stay in his fortress, surrounded by his men, and wait. It was a sound tactical decision, but it was also an admission of defeat. He had surrendered the wilderness to the ghost, and he had turned his own sanctuary into a cage where he and his terrified men now waited for the hunter to come to them. And Calder Holt was a very, very patient hunter. Bo Ramsey's retreat into his canyon fortress was a signal to Calder that the nature of the war had changed. The hunt was over. The siege had begun. Ramsey had turned his den into a prison, and he and his remaining dozen men were the terrified inmates. For 2 weeks, a tense and natural quiet settled over the region. Calder did not attack the canyon. He simply watched. From his hidden perches in the high rocks, he became a constant, invisible presence. He wanted their fear to fester. He wanted the confinement and paranoia to do his work for him. Inside the canyon, the Red Creek gang was slowly disintegrating. The men were like caged animals, snapping at each other, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. They drank heavily, their bravado gone, replaced by a sullen, simmering dread. They never knew when the ghost was watching. Every shadow on the canyon wall, every strange sound on the wind, was a potential threat. Bo Ramsey's leadership was cracking under the strain. He became a tyrant, his paranoia turning him against his own men. He accused one of being a coward, another of wanting to desert. He ruled now not with respect, but with pure, brutal intimidation. The loyalty that had held the gang together was dissolving like sugar in water. Calder knew that a direct assault on the canyon was still suicide. The entrance was a natural kill box, easily defended. He needed a way to get inside, to walk amongst them, and seen. He needed to become a serpent in their poison garden. His plan came to him as he was reviewing his old journal. He found an entry on a small-time whiskey runner named Finn, a man known for his cowardice and his willingness to work for anyone who paid. The journal noted that Finn often supplied Ramsey's operation. Calder spent 3 days tracking Finn. He found him in a seedy cantina on the Mexican border. He didn't confront him with a gun. He confronted him with a choice. Calder laid out a stack of gold coins on the grimy table between them. "That's $500, Calder said, his voice a low whisper. "It's yours. All you have to do is get sick." Finn stared at the gold, his eyes wide with greed and fear. "Ramsey is expecting a shipment from you in 2 days," Calder continued. "You're not going to make it. Your wagon is going to have a broken axle. You're going to send your new partner instead. A quiet man, eager for work. Me." Finn was terrified. To cross Bo Ramsey was a death sentence, but to refuse the cold-eyed man sitting opposite him seemed like an even more immediate one. And the gold was a powerful argument. "He'll kill me," Finn stammered. "I'll kill you right now if you don't," Calder said, his voice flat. "Do this for me, and you take the gold and ride east. You never come back. Or, you can refuse, and your story ends right here." Finn, a man whose only loyalty was to his own survival, made the only choice he could. 2 days later, Calder Holt drove a rickety wagon, loaded with barrels of cheap whiskey, up to the entrance of the Red Creek Gang's canyon. He had changed his appearance. His hair was cut short, his face was covered in a week's worth of stubble, and he wore the simple, dusty clothes of a teamster. He had adopted a slight slouch, a downcast gaze. He was no one, just another piece of human driftwood. The 2 guards at the entrance, men whose faces he knew intimately from his spyglass, stopped him, their rifles leveled. "Who are you?" one of them barked. "Name's Ames," Calder mumbled, not meeting their eyes. "Finn's new partner. He took sick down near Socorro. Axle broke. He sent me on with the delivery." The guards were suspicious. In their heightened state of paranoia, everyone was a threat. One of them went to get Ramsey. Ramsey came out, his face bloated and red from heavy drinking, his eyes narrowed and suspicious. He circled Calder, looking him up and down. Calder kept his gaze on the ground, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. This was the most dangerous moment. If Ramsey recognized him, it was over. But Ramsey didn't see the silent, vengeful rancher. He saw a stooped and remarkable teamster. He saw what he expected to see, a nobody. "You're a long way from home, Ames," Ramsey said, testing him. "Just looking for work, boss," Calder replied, his voice a meek mumble. Ramsey, desperate for his whiskey and convinced of his own ability to judge a man, made his decision. "All right. Unload the wagon. And tell Finn if he's late again, I'll peel the skin from his back." Calder had done it. He was inside. The serpent was in the garden. He spent the day unloading the barrels, working slowly, his head down, observing everything. He saw the deep cracks in the gang's morale. He saw the open contempt the men had for Ramsey. He saw the fear that was a constant and spoken presence. He identified his next target, a man named Curtis, the gang's cook. Curtis was an old, bitter man who was not a gunman, but a camp follower. More importantly, he was the one man who had access to everyone's food and drink. That night, Calder found Curtis behind the cook tent, sampling his own whiskey stock. Calder approached him silently. "That's good whiskey," Calder said, his voice no longer the meek mumble of Ames. Curtis jumped, spinning around, his hand reaching for a butcher knife. He stopped when he saw the cold, gray eyes of the stranger. Calder didn't threaten him. He made him a business proposition. He showed him a small, heavy pouch. "That's gold," Calder said. "More than Ramsey will pay you in 10 years. All you have to do is help me." He gave Curtis a small, corked vial filled with a clear liquid. It was a powerful, fast-acting purgative, a medicine he had acquired from a border town herbalist. It wasn't a poison. It wouldn't kill them. It would just make them violently, horribly ill. "Tomorrow night, Ramsey is planning a celebration," Calder said. "A feeble attempt to boost his men's morale. You're going to be cooking a big stew. You're going to put this in it. All of it." Curtis stared at the vial, then at the gold, his mind working. He hated Ramsey. He was terrified of the ghost that was hunting them. And he was greedy. "What's in it for me?" Curtis asked, his voice a nervous croak. "You get the gold," Calder said. "And you get to live." The next evening, the camp was filled with a forced, pathetic attempt at revelry. Ramsey had ordered the stew and an extra ration of whiskey for everyone. He wanted to remind them that he was still the provider, the leader. Calder, the quiet teamster, kept to the shadows, watching as the men lined up, tin plates in hand. He watched as Curtis, his face pale and sweaty, ladled out the stew. He watched as they all ate, Ramsey included. An hour later, the first man groaned and clutched his stomach. Then another. Within 30 minutes, the entire Red Creek gang, from its fearsome leader to its lowest thug, was incapacitated. They were rolling on the ground, groaning, vomiting, their bodies racked with debilitating cramps. They were helpless. An army, defeated not by guns or knives, but by a simple stomach ailment. In the midst of the chaos, a single, quiet figure moved through the camp. Calder Holt, his face a grim mask, walked from one groaning outlaw to the next. He wasn't there to offer aid. He was there to collect their guns. He stripped them of every pistol, every rifle, every knife. He piled the weapons in the center of the camp. Then he turned his attention to Bo Ramsey, who was curled in a fetal position outside his tent, weeping in agony. Calder crouched down beside him. Ramsey looked up, his eyes wide with recognition and horrified understanding. "You?" he gasped. "Nate," Calder said. He didn't kill him. He just looked at him, letting the man stew in his own filth and humiliation. The complete and utter degradation was a more fitting punishment than a quick bullet. He had done it. He had single-handedly disarmed and defeated an entire outlaw gang without firing a single shot. He was not just a ghost. He was a plague. He walked to the corral, retrieved his own stolen horses, and calmly rode out of the canyon, leaving behind a scene of chaos and misery. The siege was over. Now, only the final reckoning remained. Calder did not ride far. He took the horses to his ruined ranch, a place no one would think to look for him, and waited. He knew the final act of this play was not yet written. He had broken the Red Creek gang, humiliated them, and stripped them of their weapons. But he had left their leader, Bo Ramsey, alive. It was a calculated risk. A man like Ramsey, stripped of everything, would not simply crawl away and die. His pride and rage would demand one final, desperate gamble. Calder was counting on it. Back in the canyon, it took 2 full days for the gang to recover from their violent illness. They were weak, demoralized, and, worst of all, unarmed. The camp was a stinking, miserable wreck. The men who were still able to walk began to desert, slipping away in the night, wanting no more part of the cursed outfit that had been so thoroughly dismantled by a ghost. By the 3rd day, only 5 men remained with Bo Ramsey. They were his most loyal, or perhaps most stupid, followers. Ramsey himself was a changed man. The blustering, arrogant leader was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed creature consumed by a singular, obsessive need for revenge. He had lost his fortune, his army, and his reputation. All he had left was his hatred. He knew he couldn't fight the ghost in the wilderness. He had been outmaneuvered at every turn. He had to lure the ghost to him. He needed to create bait. He and his 5 remaining men rode into redemption. They were a pathetic sight, a shadow of their former glory. But they were still armed with the few pistols they had managed to hide, and in a town like Redemption, that was enough. They stormed into the saloon, same one that sold their brand of whiskey, the saloon where Calder had started his hunt. Ramsey's plan was born of pure, spiteful evil. He knew the ghost's vengeance was personal. It had started with the burning of the ranch. So, he would give the ghost another reason to come. He would take something from the town that had silently watched his downfall. He and his men took the saloon hostage. The dozen or so patrons, miners, drifters, and the saloon's owner were herded into the center of the room at gunpoint. "Here's the message you're going to send to your ghost," Ramsey roared, his voice a raw and hinge shriek. He grabbed the saloon owner. "You're going to tell him that Bo Ramsey has the good people of redemption. And every hour that he doesn't show his face, one of them is going to die. We'll start with you." It was an act of sheer terrorism. A desperate man lashing out at the world. The news spread through the town like a disease. A terrified barmaid, who had hidden in the pantry, slipped out a back window and ran to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a man who had long been on Ramsey's payroll, found himself in an impossible position. He was a coward, but even he couldn't ignore a public hostage situation. He gathered his two equally useless deputies, and they took up a token position across the street, their main contribution being to keep the growing crowd of onlookers at a safe distance. Word of the standoff reached Calder by that evening. A young boy from the livery stable, the same one who had first given him information, rode out to the valley at great risk to himself. He found Calder sitting calmly by a small fire amidst the ruins of his home. The boy blurted out the story, his voice trembling with fear and excitement. "He's gonna kill him, mister. Holt. He's gonna kill them all. The sheriff ain't doing nothing." Calder listened, his expression unchanging. His gray eyes seemed to darken, to harden. He had wanted to end this quietly. But Ramsey, in his madness, had made it public. He had dragged innocent people into their war. "Thank you, son," Calder said, his voice a low rumble. "You did a brave thing coming here. Now go home, lock your doors, and stay off the street." After the boy left, Calder stood up. He walked to the charred remains of his cabin and kicked at the ashes. He was not a hero. He was not a lawman. He was a creature of vengeance, a ghost who hunted in the shadows. He had no stake in the town of redemption. Its people had done nothing for him. But Sarah had loved towns. She had loved the idea of community, of people looking out for one another. She would not have stood by. And the ghosts of his wife and son, the quiet companions of his solitude, would not let him stand by now. He had left Ramsey alive to make him suffer. But his suffering was now spilling over onto others. The final reckoning could be postponed no longer. Ramsey had sent an invitation to hell. And Calder Holt was going to RSVP in person. He saddled his buckskin mare. He checked the loads in his Colt. He tucked the bowie knife into his belt. He was no longer the meticulous planner, the patient stalker. The time for subtlety was over. The time for fear had been a prelude. Now was the time for the storm. He rode out of his valley as the moon rose, a solitary, dark figure on a pale horse. He was not riding to save the town. He was not riding for justice. He was riding to finish a job. The ghost hand had been summoned, and he was about to make his final, bloody appearance. The final bullet was about to be fired, and hell was coming with him. The ride from his valley to redemption was a journey through memory. The pale moonlight painted the landscape in shades of silver and black, a world of ghosts. Calder rode at a steady and hurried pace. The frantic energy of a chase was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. He was no longer the hunter, he was the executioner. He didn't ride directly to the town. He circled around, approaching from the south, using the familiar hills and arroyos as his cover. He dismounted a half-mile out and made the final approach on foot, a shadow moving through the darkness. He found a vantage point on the roof of the general store, directly across the dusty street from the saloon. From here, he could see everything. The saloon's batwing doors were closed, and its windows were dark, but he could see the silhouettes of Ramsey's men moving inside. He saw the useless sheriff and his two deputies huddled behind an overturned water trough, looking more like frightened children than lawmen. And he saw the townspeople, a silent, fearful crowd kept at a distance. He settled into wait. He was not a man to be rushed. He needed to understand the rhythm of the situation, to know the layout of his battlefield. He watched for hours, a statue of patience. He saw one of Ramsey's men occasionally crack open a window to peer out. He noted the position of the lamps inside, which cast the men's shadows on the walls. He was mapping the interior of the saloon in his mind. As he watched, he thought of Sarah. She would have hated this. The senseless violence, the terror inflicted on innocent people. She had been the gentle part of him, the part that had believed in a world where a man could build a home and raise a family in peace. When she died, that part of him had died with her. Or so he had thought. But as he looked down at the town, at the helpless people held captive by a madman, he felt a flicker of something other than cold rage. It was a dull, aching sense of responsibility. He had left Ramsey alive. This was, in part, his doing. He had a duty to end it, not just for himself, but for them. It was a strange and welcome feeling. He knew that to walk through the front door would be suicide. 6 guns against 1, even for a man of his skill, were impossible odds. He needed to even the field. He needed to bring the darkness inside with him. His plan began to form, a grim and silent piece of strategy. He slipped off the roof and made his way unseen to the alley behind the saloon. He knew these buildings. He knew their construction. The back of the saloon had one small, barred window for the storeroom, and a single, sturdy back door. He had one advantage. Ramsey and his men were focused on the front. They were expecting the attack to come from the street, from the law, from the ghost they thought they knew. They would not be watching the back. He found a stack of empty crates behind the building. He began to pile them, one on top of the other, creating a makeshift ladder to the roof. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, making almost no sound. Once on the flat roof, he crawled to the front edge. He could hear Ramsey's voice, a drunken, angry roar, drifting up from below. He was tormenting his hostages, enjoying his final, pathetic moments of power. Calder had one more piece of preparation. From his saddlebags, he had taken a small, tightly sealed tin of kerosene. He carefully, silently, began to pour a thin line of it along the front edge of the roof, directly above the saloon's entrance and windows. The wood of the roof's facade was old and dry as tinder. He left the longer trail of the kerosene leading back to the rear of the roof. Then, he went back down to the alley. He approached the back door. It was barred from the inside, he knew, but the wood was old. He found a loose board at the base of the wall next to the door. Using his Bowie knife, he painstakingly, silently, began to pry it loose. It was slow, agonizing work. Every creak of the wood sounded like a cannon shot in the tense silence. After what felt like an eternity, he had created a hole just big enough to squeeze through. He slipped inside. He was in the saloon storeroom. It was dark and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. He could hear the voices from the main room clearly now. He could hear the fear in the hostages' breathing. He crept to the door that led from the storeroom to the bar. He put his eye to a crack in the wood. He could see them. Ramsey and his 5 men, all armed, all drunk, all dangerous. The hostages were huddled in a corner. The time was almost right. He was in position. The serpent was not just in the garden. He was in the house. He slipped back out through the hole in the wall. He climbed back onto the roof one last time. He took out a match. He looked down at the town, at the fearful faces in the crowd, at the pathetic excuse for lawmen. He looked at the saloon, a bright island of defiant evil in the quiet darkness. This was the calm. The final, deep breath before the plunge. He was not just bringing a gun to this fight. He was bringing a reckoning. He was bringing the fire that had started this all. Full circle. He struck the match. The small flame flickered, a tiny, defiant star in the vast darkness. He touched it to the trail of kerosene. A line of fire hissed across the roof, racing toward the front edge. The storm was about to break. The line of fire raced across the roof, a fiery serpent, and reached the kerosene-soaked facade. The old, dry wood erupted in a sudden, violent whoosh of flame. The entire front of the saloon became a wall of fire. Below, the crowd screamed and fell back. The sheriff and his deputies dove for cover. Inside the saloon, the reaction was one of pure, panic chaos. The windows shattered from the intense heat, showering the room with glass and allowing thick, black smoke to pour in. Ramsey's men, who had been focused on the street, spun around, their faces masks of disbelief and terror. Their fortress had become a funeral pyre. This was the moment Calder had created. While their attention was on the fire at the front, he slipped back through the hole in the storeroom wall. He moved through the storeroom and kicked open the door to the main bar. He stepped into the room like a nightmare made flesh. He was a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the flames raging outside, his face a grim, emotionless mask, the Colt in his hand seeming like a natural extension of his arm. The 6 outlaws were caught between the fire and the ghost. Their drunken bravado evaporated. Their discipline shattered. They were just 6 terrified men in a burning, smoke-filled room. One of them, the closest to the storeroom door, recovered first. He raised his pistol, his eyes wide with terror. The saloon was filled with the deafening roar of Calder's Colt. It was not a frantic series of shots. It was a slow, deliberate, and utterly final rhythm. Boom. The first outlaw was thrown backward, a look of surprise on his face. The others reacted, turning to fire at the shadow in the doorway. Their shots were wild, panicked, lost in the smoke and confusion. Boom. A second man, who was trying to use a table for cover, clutched his chest and collapsed. Calder moved from the doorway, stepping into the room. He moved with a calm and hurried grace that was terrifying to behold. He was not a man in a gunfight. He was a craftsman at his work. The smoke swirled around him, the flames from the windows casting his long, dancing shadow across the room. 2 more outlaws, standing near the bar, raised their rifles. Boom, boom. 2 shots, so close together they sounded like one. Both men fell. Now only Bo Ramsey and his last man were left. They were at the far end of the room, near the hostages, who were screaming and huddled on the floor. Ramsey's last man made a fatal mistake. He saw the hostages as a shield. Calder didn't hesitate. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the small triangle of the outlaw's shoulder that was visible above the hostage's own. Boom. The outlaw screamed as the bullet shattered his collarbone, his arm going limp. The hostage broke free and scrambled away. Now, it was just Ramsey. He stood there, a wild, cornered animal, his face a mask of hate and disbelief. He had been so close to his final, spiteful victory. Now, he was facing the ghost he had created, the quiet rancher he had dismissed. He raised his pistol, his hand shaking with rage. "I'll see you in hell, Holt," he screamed. Boom. Calder's last bullet took Ramsey square in the chest. The force of the impact slammed him back against the wall. He slid down, leaving a dark smear of blood, his eyes wide with the final, ultimate surprise. Silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the terrified sobs of the hostages. Calder stood in the center of the room, his Colt smoking in his hand, a solitary, grim figure surrounded by the bodies of his enemies. The devil's dance was over. He walked over to the hostages. "Get out," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Go." They scrambled to their feet and fled out the back door, stumbling into the night and the arms of the astonished townspeople. Calder stood alone in the burning saloon for a long moment. He looked at the bodies, at the destruction. He felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Only a vast, cold emptiness. The job was done. The ghosts were quiet. He walked to the bar and found an unopened bottle of whiskey. He broke the neck on the edge of the counter and poured the contents onto the floor, feeding the flames. He gave the place its funeral pyre. Then, he turned and walked out the back door, disappearing into the smoke and the darkness, leaving the fire to consume the last remnants of the Red Creek gang. The last bullet had been fired. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, it revealed a scene of shocking clarity. The saloon was a blackened, smoldering ruin, a skeletal testament to the night's violence. The rest of the town was untouched, but a profound, almost sacred silence had fallen over it. The people of redemption began to emerge from their homes, drawn to the town square. They moved in small, quiet groups, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, incredible sense of relief. They gathered around the sheriff's office, where the rescued hostages were telling their story in hushed, trembling voices. They spoke of a ghost, a tall, silent man who had appeared from the smoke and fire, a figure of absolute and hurried lethality who had dismantled an entire gang in the space of 6 heartbeats. In the center of the dusty square, a solitary figure stood. It was Calder Holt. He was just standing there, his back to the rising sun, his face smudged with soot, his duster coated in ash. His hands, hanging at his sides, were stained with blood and powder burns. His Colt was back in its holster. He was looking at the ruins of the saloon, though his gaze seemed to be focused on something much farther away. The townspeople kept their distance, watching him with a mixture of reverence and terror. He was their savior, the man who had done what their lawmen could not. But he was also a terrifying figure, a man who had brought a storm of apocalyptic violence to their doorstep. He was not one of them. He was something other. Marshall Thompson from Cheyenne would later say that men like Calder Holt were a necessary evil in a land that was still being born, men who operated outside the law to create a space where the law could eventually take root. They were the hard, violent men who made the world safe for the gentle ones. Calder seemed oblivious to the stares, to the whispers. He had finished his business. The Red Creek gang was a memory. The debt had been paid. The ghosts of his wife and son were finally, truly, quiet. The conversation he had been having with them for 5 long years was over. All that was left was the silence. He reached down and plucked a single, tough blade of prairie grass from the dusty ground. He stuck it between his lips and began to chew on it slowly, a simple, rustic gesture that was completely at odds with the carnage of the previous night. Then, without a word, without a glance at the town he had just saved, he turned and began to walk. He walked past the silent crowd, past the sheriff's office, toward the alley where he had left his horse. The people parted before him, a silent, respectful path. He was no longer Silent Holt, the reclusive rancher. He was not the ghost hand, the legendary bounty hunter. He was something in between, a man who had passed through their lives like a force of nature, a wildfire that had burned away the sickness so that new growth could begin. He reached his horse, swung himself into the saddle, and rode out of town, heading back toward his own ruined valley. He didn't look back. He left behind a town that was forever changed, and a new legend to be told around campfires. They would speak of the silent rancher who had brought a hellish reckoning, the ghost who had appeared in the fire. But as he rode into the vast, empty landscape, Calder Holt was not thinking of legends. He was thinking of the silence. The blessed, welcome, and utterly empty silence that was now his only companion. The storm was over, and all that remained was the quiet echo of its passing.